Hello and welcome to Mystics and Muons. This episode is a presentation that I gave at the Sunstone Symposium in 2024, and I wanted to give it again for the podcast. It's entitled Spirituality, Science, Psychology, and Psychedelics, Integrating the Restoration. My name is Gabe Prue, and I host the Mystics and Muons podcast, which you probably already know because you're listening to this. But a little bit about me first, just so you kind of have some context for this presentation and where I'm coming from. I'm a dentist. That's my day job. I'm a father. I've got 2 boys, a husband, brother. I've got 4 brothers and a son. Both my parents were converts to Mormonism. And my background is in the sciences. I've got an undergraduate degree in bioinformatics, and my minor is in computer science, so fairly hard sciences. And then I went to dental school, so I've got a doctoral degree in dentistry. And like I said, I host the podcast Mystics and Muons, covering the intersection between science and spirituality and philosophy, and sometimes covering the esoteric, mystical origins of Mormonism as well. My journey in Mormonism, I was raised in Mormonism. I left in 2016, and I was a very, very orthodox, very black and white thinking, very exactly obedient. I was that missionary. And then in 2016, left, didn't come to any conclusions of it's all a fraud, or this is what happened. More just these things don't add up in the literal narrative that was presented to me. And I knew a lot of these things that, throughout my life, I was pretty aware of the anti-Mormon, the apologist discussion on these topics, but I never really approached it with real intent and gave myself permission to kind of go where my intuition, get whatever answer that whatever answer at the end of the question, rather than deciding where I want to end up and then going from there. And my current perspective, because I think this is really helpful, whenever you're reading or listening to somebody talk about metaphysical or spiritual religious things, is to try to piece together where they're coming from. I think Michael Quinn does a good job of this at the beginning of his book on early Mormonism and the magic worldview, just kind of letting you know so that you can be aware of what filter that I have, because we all have a filter. So my philosophical, metaphysical perspective is that dreams are the best framework for understanding reality, both philosophically, spiritually, and scientifically as well. And I'll get into that a little more right now. So dreams being the framework for understanding reality. So this would fall under idealism, the idea that the philosophical, the monist, everything comes from one thing, the monist idea that one thing is that the universe is a mind or a network of information, and ultimately everything comes from one mind, one thing. And that means that we, are dissociated parts of the one, which is experiencing it itself. And that's kind of this whole experience is the one looking at itself or experiencing itself through many different perspectives. So it means that our identity as a self or an ego is an illusion. It's a useful illusion, not the fundamental truth. And I should say, if anybody's listening to this in podcast or audio form, there is a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going through. You'll still be able to follow most of this without it, but it's available on YouTube if you want to look at the text as well. So this idea that reality is essentially kind of a dream, it seems like a bizarre perspective, or that there's not an objective physical world that is all from one mind. It seems like a bizarre perspective because we feel so separate, feel so individual. Reality feels so real. And I would say that, reality is real. It's just not the type of real we thought. And then we need to get curious about what do we mean by this is real or this is truth. I think reality is really what you experience. There's different types of reality, different levels of objectiveness or intersubjectiveness of the reality of your experience with the reality of somebody's experience. But, your dream, like, that's real. You're experiencing that. It's just not a consensus reality with other minds at the waking level. So dreams as a model for reality, I think it's so useful because these are really ineffable concepts. And to have kind of a metaphor or a parable or an experience where we can really grok these really difficult to understand concepts, it's useful, somewhat necessary, particularly to convey this to other people that haven't experienced it. Experience, or like a gnosis, is the best way. But dreams are a nightly experience that shows you how it feels to be one. You are one mind when you're awake, but also separate. You're creating a physical, quote unquote, physical reality, something that you're experiencing as a physical reality out of that mind. So you can, as the dreamer, you can go from, 1 minute being one fairly integrated mind, experiencing what you feel as a 3D world, separate than yourself. That one mind can dissociate even just minutes later. There are some times where you can go right into sleep, into like a nap, and then go right into REM. Minutes later, you dissociate. That one mind dissociates into like a good chunk of that mental activity, or kind of computing power, if you want to look at it in that sense, goes to like running the dream avatar program. Like, that's a perspective from which you're experiencing the rest of that mental activity. And the rest of that mental activity manifests as third-person perspectives. There's other characters in your dream. There's a physical world. What you experience as a physical world and as time, it's at a different level, different fidelity than waking reality. And this really makes sense, actually. It's kind of like the simulation argument, except it's, we have our own simulation every night. There's no computer that the simulation is kind of running on. It's a simulation within a simulation, essentially. So, if you think of like a computer with a virtual machine, which means you can run Windows on a Mac laptop, or you can run like a little program that acts like a whole Windows computer within your Windows computer, and you can run like 10 of them. Each level down you go, you're dividing up that computing power. And so to try to get things to work, it doesn't have the same fidelity or quality or logic there. And that's the same thing that's happening in the dream sense. And that also goes in the other direction too, that people talk about these NDEs, near-death experiences or mystical experiences, where like, oh, this is realer than real. Like, and only there do you know that it's realer than real, and that like waking life is sort of like a dream. That tracks with this philosophy. So in that dream, I would ask, who are you? It seems obvious that, you're the dream avatar. That's what we often think. Like, in my dream, I was doing this. But then, who are the other characters? Who's that person that you fought with the dream? Who's the monster? Who's the physical world? Like, that is you. That is also you. Not you as the dream avatar, but the higher self, the more expanded definition of self. It's all coming from you as the dreamer, that one mind. And so that means that, this level of reality, kind of like conception, is also can be viewed within that framework. So what's happening here, I would say, is that you're experiencing that the phenomenon that a spotlight of awareness can be focused on one part of the mind, with the rest of the mind manifest into people, into scenarios, into a world that seems so separate than you. So then lucid dreaming, if you're not familiar, is the concept or the phenomenon of recognizing that you're in a dream when you're in a dream. And it's not a binary thing. There's different degrees of lucidity, from the lowest, just recognizing that you're in a dream, to the highest of like recognizing your dream, gaining some coherence with the rest of the mental activity, and changing the dream, being able to fly, being able to control the environment around you. And there's many states in between. So the parallel to that I would say that this is achievable in this level of reality, and that's analogous to the spiritual awakening or enlightenment. And, there's kind of fraught terms, but just some level, again, there's a degree as well. You can intellectually or cognitively be aware of or have some experience of like, oh yeah, there's a deeper fundamental reality than what I'm experiencing right now, but that doesn't guarantee that you have control over it to higher degrees of control or lucidity. So questions that I'd be interested in you pondering is, how do you know that you aren't in a dream now? And I think most people would say that they're very sure that they're not in a dream. And so if you are sure, weren't you also sure last night? Or wouldn't you have been last night sure that you were not in a dream when you were in a dream? So what if somebody told you while you were in a dream that you were in a dream? What kind of arguments or logic would you use? And I ask these questions just to kind of bring awareness to the fact that the same type of arguments that we would use in a dream, that we would argue with somebody else if we didn't gain lucidity, when somebody questioned us or told us that, would be the exact same arguments now. Like, well, I know I'm not in a dream because like this is real. I can feel this. I can't control you. I know I'm not in a dream because I remember my dream last night, and that's very different than what I feel now. And like, I just don't know how to explain it. But when you're not in a dream, like you really know you're not in a dream, but it isn't until you actually pop up to the next layer that you realize like, oh yeah, I did think I was not in a dream, but you really can't experience that or have that awareness within it. So just kind of keep in mind that those arguments that you would use would still apply. They'd be the same arguments. So try to bring some awareness and question how logical they are. And are those arguments, explainable by this idea of kind of the constraint of computing power or mental power of these stacked dreams or dream spaces. So there's some real world parallels to this. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID, is the proper term for what we used to call multiple personality disorder, where you've got multiple personalities or personas, essentially kind of dissociated, walled off chunks of mental activity that are separate than the other. That's really different kind of egos within one mind. And they often don't have awareness. If one alter ego is kind of front and center, when the others come to, they often don't remember or have any recollection of the other ones. So there's a study that shows that when somebody with DID is asked to recall a dream, different alter egos can recall the same dream, but as different characters in that dream. And so essentially I would say that that's kind of an example of how one mind can simultaneously be experiencing what appears as an objective reality, but is really kind of an intersubjective reality. And so like in that situation, two alter egos may meet in a dream or have a recollection of meeting in a dream, and they may have different accounts of what event happened or how it happened, depending on their beliefs and their filters. But there's not actually like an objective, like, well, what really happened? If we had a third person, like tiebreaker, what happened? Because they would have their own filter as well. So there's not an objective dream space made of something other than the alter egos that they're filtering. Really, the objective fact or reality of the dream would be a summation of all of those different perspectives. And similarly, in idealism would say that in this level of reality, that there's not an objective physical world that's made out of atoms that exists whether or not it's perceived or not, but rather we are all multiple perspectives creating a consensus reality, having an intersubjective experience. So in Hinduism and Tibetan Buddhism, there's also this idea, they're grounded in this dreamlike view of reality. Hinduism has this idea that essentially God, the universe, has fallen asleep, and we're all manifestations or avatars of God experiencing the rest of ourselves, other aspects of God in this dream, and kind of awakening to that awakening to our own true nature of reality. And Tibetan Buddhism as well is grounded in essentially these stacked layers of dreams, really similar to Inception. And there's this practice of dream yoga where you're essentially gaining lucidity, meditating within dreams, which is apparently easier to kind of wrap up and to get to these nirvanic states, this coherence of all the mental activity. So our experience of reality is really, I would say, the focused awareness, a focused awareness of the one mind, identifying with a subset of the one mind, dissociating itself from parts of, a large part of the rest of the one mind, so that it can experience, the rest of that mind projected out as people, scenarios, and a physical world. That means that we are co-creators in a consensus reality or an intersubjective reality, and that our true identity is, or our higher self is the one. This might sound sort of like solipsism, because it essentially is solipsism, but for God, not for you. It's not all in your mind, but it's all in the one mind. And we are different kind of multi-threaded, simultaneous, recursive processes experiencing that mind. So this means that the question isn't, is it real, or is something real, or is that phenomenon real, but rather, what kind of real is it? We are essentially Dom Cobb in Inception, and I'm going to argue that quantum physics can essentially be our totem, which is the thing that he would use to give him a clue as to whether he was in a dream or not, whether it followed certain rules. Some interesting scriptures that I think kind of echo or go along with this. In Jacob 7:26 in the Book of Mormon, the time passed away with us, and also our lives passed away, like as it were unto us a dream, we being a lonesome and a solemn people, wanderers. John 14:2, in my Father's house are many mansions, which, I think could be talking about this. There's one house, but within that house there are these whole different perspectives, different mansions. And John 17:21, that they may all be one, this is the intercessory prayer, that they all may be one as thou, Father, art in me and I in thee, that they also may be one in us. Which I would say that this is literally, whether Christ said this or whether somebody was attributing to this archetypal Christ, that this is talking about a literal oneness, not a physical oneness, not a be one in purpose and in spirit, but you're really actually separate, but it's one in mind, because you are an emanation from this one mind. So I want to talk about working models or frameworks. Essentially, working models are simplified representations that we use, that our mind uses to grasp complex concepts, ways that we can kind of break down, order the chaos. And we use this in science, psychology, spirituality, philosophy, everything that we interact with. We're not necessarily aware of it, but we have these working models. And the way that we develop these the processes we observe, and then eventually we start to recognize and find patterns. And then based on those patterns and those rules, we start to create a model so that we can kind of predict and manipulate those patterns. And then we use that model to achieve whatever we're trying to optimize, whatever goal we're trying to optimize. And so we often get stuck into this, well, is this true? Is that model true? Is that religion true? Is that philosophy true? Is science, Newtonian physics true? But I think that's kind of begs the question of what do you mean by true? And what's more useful to ask is does this model have explanatory power? Does it consistently, coherently explain what you're experiencing in a way that you can understand, that you can predict it? Does that model have power, empower you to achieve your goals? And that differs from person to person. Are you trying to optimize happiness? That's very different than somebody who's trying to optimize like manipulation of the physical world. So like some people are using the model of religion or spirituality, and others are using the model of, chemistry, science, and not aware that they're going after different goals. And even within this model, there's a sense of truth, I think, that is their internal consistency too. So all these models are based on prior assumptions. And there's something called Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which is this idea that all logical proofs or formal models are built on some thing that you kind of have to boot it up with, that you're not able to prove within the model. And often we're not aware of the assumptions that start our frameworks. A lot of religious and atheist debates are kind of based on this prior assumption that the question is that there is either an external God or that God does not exist, which is kind of a laughably simplistic dichotomy to start from. So within these logical models that you're building, these working models, is it internally consistent? Does it have to change the rules depending on what you're looking at? And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. I mean, you can have alternative models for doing different things. I mean, we've got Newtonian physics that works for, or classical physics that works for larger macro scaled things, but it breaks down. It doesn't work at a subatomic or a very small level. And then we've got quantum physics that works there, but would be very unwieldy to use at the macro level. So it's not that like one is true and the other is false, and that we like prove Newtonian physics false. I mean, different models are useful for different utility, the different things you're trying to optimize, whether it's happiness, money, longevity in life. So we update these models, interestingly enough, not necessarily when they break down. And you can read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions to talk about this. It's not really when the model breaks down. It's really only when there's a better model. There's some other better way that we find to explain what we're experiencing. And I think this kind of goes with faith transitions as well. I mean, there is, the model breaking down leads us to start exploring other models. Is there another way of looking at this that works better for whatever I'm trying to optimize for? So I want to share my parable of the archaeologist. So if you can imagine we're 1,000 years post some AI apocalypse, and you've got these 5 archaeologists separately. They've each found different car parts. They each will come up with their own isolated theory, which is going to be shaped by their limited information, as well as their unfamiliarity with certain fields of knowledge that's necessary, whether it's combustion, fossil fuels, transportation. So they're not aware of the other archaeologists' findings. And so the person that finds the transmission might think it's part of a complex machine for moving heavy objects, the steering wheel. That could be a ceremonial object for spiritual journeys. The person that finds the seat thinks it's a throne for ancient rulers. Archaeologist that finds a tire, that it's a flotation device for water transport. And the last that finds a gas tank might think it's a container for sacred oils. So there's generally not going to be any consensus. Either the archaeologist is going to be convinced in their own theory, or they may just conclude that the true nature of this artifact is unknowable. There's not enough information. We just give up. We don't know. But if you take a new group of 5 archaeologists that collaboratively review all the findings, it's much more likely that they're going to achieve a consensus and likely realize that it's a vehicle through integrating all these models. They're able to see, like, of all the possibilities that each one of these things could be, like, what is the overlap? What works, what fits all these, and what theories don't. So what is a meta model that satisfies all these individual findings? And this would be kind of like stabilizing a table with one leg versus multiple legs. I mean, you can You have a table with one leg and it can work. You've got to stabilize it. You've got to be right there with it. Alternatively, if you have multiple legs, there's going to be some initial effort, maybe some instability as you reach for those other legs, and you have to put the table down on the side and screw those other legs in. But eventually, as you go to 2, 3, 4 legs, you're going to get stability that you just could never achieve without. So the lesson here is that as we transcend silos of information and perspectives and integrate them, that we get to the deeper fundamental truths. And so in Mormonism, I think what this looks like is that we've got multiple models, and I've got just some of the main models here: Freemasonry, Neoplatonism, spiritual, pious fraud, psychedelics, folk magic. So, with Freemasonry, I recently read Method Infinite, which I think is an incredible book, and there's a lot of connection there that overlap things that I didn't know about Masonry that show that it is this kind of mystical, esoteric path, sort of this like Western path to enlightenment. But you run the risk of trying to make that explain everything. The same thing with Neoplatonism. There's a lot of overlap with Joseph Smith and the more esoteric eternal progression, eternal marriage, pre-existence. There's a lot of overlap with that in these Platonic ideas, and potentially some ways where he was exposed to that through writings or kind of in a lateral transmission of ideas. But again, there's this tendency that you could attribute everything to that and kind of be blinded to the other things that could be playing in here. There's the spiritual perspective, which is kind of the orthodox perspective of what many of us were taught and grew up believing, that Joseph Smith was a prophet, he was called of God. The Book of Mormon is a literal book, a historical book of people that lived on the Americas. Pious fraud, I think there's a lot of benefit there that, it's much more likely that Joseph Smith believed in much of what he was saying, that, maybe he was a fraud and these things weren't true, but that he himself believed in some of that. I think that's a lot more credible and makes a lot more sense than some of these theories that everything's a fraud. And this starts to, I think, have like a valid explanation for some of the challenges, like Jeffrey Holland's challenge of why would somebody, go to Carthage reading the Book of Mormon and go to his grave on this fraud. Psychedelics, I think there's increasing reason to consider this and consider the psychedelic experience, the overlap with the mystical experience, and endogenous versus exogenous experiences, and question whether Joseph Smith personally or whether the group experiences like the Curtin Temple dedication, whether exogenous or substances were used as part of these group mystical experiences. But again, it's easy to get into this trap of filtering everything through that. And finally, folk magic. D. Michael Quinn's book was incredible, and I think shows just how much, folk magic wasn't just something that that was the culture of the time. We could just kind of forget it because Joseph Smith moved away from that. But this is how he viewed the world. And there's so much overlap of this kind of Venn diagram here of all these different things. Like there's a center point where all of these overlap. And folk magic, there is a lot of folk magic that involves substances and altered states of consciousness, from exogenous, substances, or just endogenous, states of consciousness that you can get through meditation or trance states. We risk confabulating explanations if we just focus on one of these circles in the Venn diagram without seeing where they all overlap. So I'm advocating an integrative approach. Black and white thinking really reflects our lack of awareness of our computational bounds. You don't know what you don't know. So if you think about in 2 dimensions, if you have a coin, all you know is 2 dimensions. That's your perspective. One person can see the head side, the other person can see the tail side. Both are absolutely convinced that they are seeing the truth of, they're looking at the same object, and that there's no way that the other person can be true. And that makes perfect sense unless you kind of aware of that prior assumption, which in this case would be that you've only got 2 dimensions, and question that and are open to, well, maybe there's another dimension here where both are true. It is heads and it's tails. And this requires the awareness that what we perceive is a lower dimensional slice of big T truth, or the ineffable truth. So each framework, when we take it too literally, each silo, if we extend it too far, you eventually risk confabulating explanations. And I think these siloed frameworks for Mormonism break when they encounter new information and new challenges and just try to explain them through whatever drum they're banging. And that really we need to integrate these approaches and say, like, yeah, there's a lot of these Neoplatonism or psychedelics or folk magic, but how this new information, maybe this other lens is a more helpful perspective, and where those two lenses overlap. So we're going to take a little detour now into quantum physics, not because quantum physics directly relates to or impacts Mormonism, but more because it's helpful, I think, to kind of loosen up or destabilize just how confident we are that like science has figured out what reality is. And if you're starting to think, I've heard this like quantum physics woo stuff or quantum physics appropriated by people. This is like really actual, rigorous, uncontested experimental data. And I'll kind of talk about where I get into the theory here. So double slit experiment is, essentially the most well-known experiment in quantum physics, I'd say. And also, if you're, thinking like, oh, I don't understand quantum physics, nobody understands quantum physics, you don't need to understand quantum physics to at least be able to understand what it disproves. So in the double slit experiment, we have particles that are shot at a detector screen, which detects where the particles fall. And in between the particle gun and the screen, there's a wall with 2 slits in it. Now, I say particles. Some of these experiments, they started out with like electrons or photons, but recently this has gone up to particles of 20,000 atoms. So people that just say, this is just some weird property of electrons or photons, it doesn't really apply to physical matter. That's not true by the latest evidence. So when you have particles that are shot at a detector screen just blocked by this wall with 2 slits, you, interestingly enough, see an interference pattern on the screen, which means that instead of just like these 2 bands that you would expect of like these particles, some of the particles go through the one slit, some go through the other slit. You just think you would see 2 bands, one behind the one behind the other. Actually, you see that it acts more as though if you had waves going to like this wall near shore that has these 2 slits, each of those slit would allow through kind of waves that would propagate out. And then where the 2 waves coming from either slits, where the high points would meet, you would have a really high wave on the shore. And then where they were out of phase, where like the high part of one wave meets with the low part of the other wave, when they finally came together, you'd actually they'd cancel each other out. So that's what's happening on the detector screen. Is there actually, you see some bands where you see a lot of particles, and other bands where you see are separated by spaces where you see no particles. So that was kind of bizarre in and of itself. You've got particles and they act like waves and not particles. And if you cover one of the slits, oddly enough, you just see a single band. So now the particles are acting like particles. You cover one slit and you just see the particles detected in a band behind the slit on the detector screen. So initially with the 2 slits, they were like waves. With one slit, now they're acting like particles. Then if you open up both slits again, if you take a detector, a device that can determine which slit the particle is going through, then interestingly enough, you have 2 bands. You have a band behind the one slit, a band behind the other slit. So instead of acting like waves, again, they're still acting like particles. Like if you determine which slit the particle is going through, like this wave-like behavior is gone, and you just get these two bands. So that's bizarre enough as it is. But then it gets even weirder. If you take the particles, you've got both slits open. If you take the particles, electrons, photons, 2,000 chunks of 2,000 atoms, you shoot them one at a time, and you wait until they hit the detector screen until you shoot the next one. You see an interference pattern. You don't see two bands. You see the particles somehow acting like a wave. But interference can only happen when there's something coming from both slits at the same time, when there's two different things interfering with each other. So if you think about this in slow motion, that particle leaves the gun, then it goes through both slits probabilistically, and each of these two kind of probabilistic realities interact with each other. So like the 50% chance that it's going through the one slit interacts with the 50% chance that it's going through the other slit, and that creates an interference pattern. Now, you've probably heard of like the many worlds hypothesis, which is this idea that, every quantum point, the universe is branched infinitely. Everything that could happen happens. But that's not what that doesn't explain this. I mean, that's bizarre in and of itself, but that doesn't explain this, because this is, if that was the case, this is not just particles in the one world that goes through the one slit and the other world that goes through the other slit, because you would still just have like one band or the other. You just still have two bands. These two different worlds are interacting with each other. The going through the one slit, going through the other slit, these two timelines are kind of overlapping with each other, and only when it hits the screen, when it's detected or measured or observed, does it fall into like a particle form. So essentially both realities are happening at the same time, interacting with each other to create this interference pattern. So what patterns you see, there's no contest of that. My explanation is really the only way I think that you can intuitively understand this, is like it's as though both realities are happening. That's my interpretation or like explanation of it. That's not the truth, but I don't think there's actually any more intuitive way of trying to explain what's happening here. And so I would say that the best way to like intuitively understand this is that all possibilities are real and interacting until we pin it down through detection, observation, or experience. So the takeaways from this, keep in mind, these aren't just photons, they're not electrons, these are particles up to 2,000 atoms, and they continually get bigger and bigger. So this weirdness, you can't just blame it on some weird property of electrons or photons, and like that's just quantum physics. These results, the interference patterns that you see when you do the different things, they're not disputed in any way. And we don't need to understand quantum physics to accept that the results at least show us that materialism, or the idea that the physical world is just, that the universe is made up of just physical things that interact with each other locally in this causal relationship, it doesn't explain reality. Any version of materialism that is stretched to allow a particle of 2,000 atoms to be in two places at once, or probabilistically be in two places at once and interact with itself, it's not truly materialism. Like, your definition of matter is so far from where you started that I don't think you can call it materialism anymore. So I would ask, is this behavior, is it more consistent with materialism or physicalism, or is it more consistent with, I would say, a dream reality? Some thoughts to ponder here. So, if you were in a dream, what happens when the character across from you in the dream asks you what you did the day before? I think, there really isn't a day before, but you, not being aware that you're in a dream, you wouldn't realize that. You would remember something. You would kind of retroactively create a story there. Or if they asked you about, tell me about your birth, like you would remember a past, you would remember a story, you would have something to say. So I think there's some overlap there of how, the story of what happens is created, like how we got to the present is created more in this dream reality. I think you see this in the quantum physics rather than this materialistic, there was a past that happened, physical matter interacts a certain way and you can trace it back. So what does this mean? I would say that this means that causality, linear time, space, physical matter, separateness, they all seem to be violated with this. You can't really have a coherent explanation for what we see in quantum physics and maintain those things that seem to be fundamentally true, like just a given causality, linear time, space, physical matter, separateness. So you don't have to agree, with my conclusions, but at least say that quantum physics at least shows us that reality doesn't work the way that you think it does. Now, there's a vested interest in downplaying the weirdness of quantum physics. There's a lot of gatekeeping physics from, the quote-unquote woo. Yet, interestingly enough, many of those people ignore the fact that one of the leading scientific theories involves like these infinitely branching worlds that happen all the time. That's pretty woo, I think. Where do you store these? Where do you keep these? And they also ignore the fact that many of the fathers of quantum physics embraced woo. I mean, Schrodinger was, the person behind the Schrodinger equation was integrating Eastern philosophy and quantum physics. And many of the fathers of quantum physics were idealists as well. So there's essentially this kind of religion of science, this group of apologists of materialists or materialism or physicalism. It's sort of people so traumatized by religion that they cling to science. There's like an ego death that they're avoiding when the fundamental prior assumption of all of their science breaks down, which is that there's an objective physical world. So while the implications, I think, are unsettling to some, I think the beauty of this is that it allows us or gives us the epistemic humility to consider that there are some other frameworks that maybe we should pay attention to when we're trying to explain Mormonism, even if we think like, oh, of course it wasn't that or it wasn't that. No data without dogma. This is a section where I want to talk about the implications of not being aware of our biases. So it's really easy to see the implications of research or a book written from a believing perspective. And it's not that that's wrong to do, but if somebody, believing Mormon, writes a history book about Mormon history, you just have to be aware, and hopefully they're aware that there's a chance that when their faith and the history conflict, there might be a tendency to favor one's dogma over kind of updating to a meta dogma, or trying to find some way that might reconcile that seeming conflict, even though it may not fit with either of those, the faith or the history. Similarly, materialism is essentially a base level dogma for many in science and just the way we view the world. Materialism is so prevalent, it's so useful, but we've forgotten that it's a model. Most people, even within science, don't understand that in science, models, theories, they're just approximations. They don't claim to be big T truth. And they're meant to be broken. They're meant to have their limits found so that we can discover new models to describe the phenomena that lay beyond the models that we just came from. The scientific method and the field of history, it's built on materialism, this idea that there's an objective physical world that exists outside of conscious perception. And that's really useful, but it's not the only option, and it's not necessarily the correct model to view all of the things that we experience. And a lot of people not in the scientific field assume that there's a scientific consensus that materialism describes the fundamental nature of reality, because it's often what you hear. That's what we've kind of based our science on with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, as we kind of swung away from religious dogma. But I think quantum physics, these experiments disprove that there is a scientific consensus. 2,000 atom particles can't exist in two places under materialism, or any definition of materialism where like particles exist in two places, or probabilistic, like wave-form, whatever hand waving you want to do. Like that's not the materialism you started that argument with. So I would say that there's actually no evidence that materialism is the right dogma for consciousness, for mystical experiences, for psychedelics, for understanding these things. And this isn't about proving that materialism is false, just that it's the wrong tool, I think, in some of these instances. Just like we didn't prove that Newtonian physics was false, and now we've got quantum physics, like that's true, and now we can get rid of Newtonian physics. It's just you need the right tool for the right job. Not only is there not evidence that it's the right dogma, I think that there's clear evidence from quantum physics that it's the wrong dogma to describe the fundamental nature of reality, even if we don't understand why or what the alternative explanation is. I think the parallel, going back to the faithful Mormon historian, the parallel to that is that it's dangerous to present frameworks when you're unaware of the dogmas that they're built on, when you think that you're being objective, when you haven't gone deep enough to figure out like what prior assumptions am I basing this argument on. All frameworks explaining Mormonism, they adopt some metaphysical framework as objective as they try to be. And that's not a bad thing. The difficulty is that when most people advocating them are unaware of this dogma that the framework is based on. And I think the most dangerous situation is when you have this delusion of objectivity, when you're unaware that materialism doesn't have a consensus, and you refuse to explore the fact that there are models that exist that handle consciousness, psychedelics, mystical experiences, quantum physics, without the hand waving that you need to do in materialism. So the goal isn't to find, the true model. It's to find the right model for the job, and also continuously try to develop meta models that integrate these lower models. So now I want to take a walk through just a few of the kind of fruits from having this type of integrative approach. First, starting with psychedelics, there's a lot of overlap between psychedelic experiences and mystical experiences. And this is just a chart that shows some of the overlaps between Joseph Smith's first vision and psychedelic experiences. Not necessarily saying that it was a psychedelic experience, but we have to question, like, why is the psychedelic experience being shown in science to have so much overlap with like these religious mystical experiences? And it doesn't necessarily mean that the first vision was a psychedelic experience, but there's a lot to explore there. So the overlap. So there's negative and challenging content in both. Joseph Smith was overcome by darkness, and in psychedelic experiences, there's often very challenging experiences. In terms of the visual phenomenon, in Joseph Smith's first vision, there's this pillar of light descending. And in psychedelic experiences, there's a lot of visual hallucinations, phenomenon, activity. There was an altered perception in both. In Joseph Smith's first vision, that the light is brighter than the noonday sun. And in psychedelic experiences, there's often very heightened sensory experiences. There's this sense of presence. In the first vision, two personages appearing. And then in psychedelic experiences, there's often this sense of presence or entity contact. There's this communication of a personal message in the first vision, which is very similar to psychedelic experiences often having a perceived communication or intuition, communication from entities or from a higher intelligence, from God, however you conceptualize it. There's an ineffability in both. Joseph Smith had difficulty fully describing the experience, and, And psychedelic experiences are often described as being beyond words. profound insights. Joseph Smith received these profound insights, answers to questions that he had. Similarly, in psychedelic experiences, people are having these profound insights and breakthroughs, revelations. There's a significant emotional impact in both the first vision, this joy and relief after initial fear, and in psychedelic experiences that can include some extreme emotional shifts during the experience and afterwards. And then there are long-lasting after effects, both from the first vision, impacts on Joseph Smith throughout the rest of his life, on his beliefs and his behavior, as well as the psychedelic experiences. One experience can lead to changes that last for years, if not forever, in somebody's worldview and behavior. So we've already accepted that the Smith family was involved in folk magic, and even though that's kind of underplayed, I think we also need to become aware of the fact that folk magic, substances and altered states of consciousness from both exogenous, so like substances, or endogenous routes, meditation, trance states, those are an integral part of folk magic. So we need to realize that there's a lot of overlap there. There's the Eleusinian mysteries, these rites that went on for 2,000 years, this mystery initiation that many of the great philosophers attended. It was mentioned in a church publication in 1837, and by many believed to include psychedelics, potentially with some evidence of ergot, which is related to, LSD in, a chalice found in the area. I think that the focus should be on the quote unquote mystical experience, what research is defining as like the mystical experience, rather than on substances, because there is a mystical experience that's accessible via a variety of routes through exogenous, endogenous, meditation, sensory deprivation, just spontaneous. It's universal across time and cultures. They exist on a spectrum between psychopathology, more unhealthy experiences, and true mystical experiences, really profoundly beneficial, with a lot of spaces in between, depending on how it's integrated. Certain individuals are much more predisposed to them. With group mystical experiences, it is more likely for them to be exogenous rather than endogenous, but it's not a guarantee. You can have group experiences that no substances are involved, but it's a little easier to do with substances. So again, just something, not evidence, but reason that we should be open to this. I think the more one explores the research, reads accounts, and experiences these states, whether through exogenous or endogenous, meditation, sensory deprivation, the idea that Joseph nailed so many elements of the mystical experience without having such an experience, like, it's just a fraud, he made this up to get money, to deceive people, I think that's less plausible than even the idea that there's an angel and golden plates there. So I think people really need to have an explanation for how that is possible and how unlikely and how much hand-waving that involves to make that sort of claim. I think the research available demands not only an acknowledgement of the mystical experience, but also that it challenges our view of reality, dismissing them as hallucinations without an understanding of consciousness, neuroscience, how we perceive or render our reality, really, I think, is a failure of due diligence. There needs to be some awareness of kind of how fraught that term hallucination is and the assumptions that go into that. Anil Seth is a neuroscientist. He's a materialist, but he really focuses on hallucinations and says that, reality is a controlled hallucination, or kind of a consensus hallucination. So this is an interesting two charts from a study called Spontaneous Spiritual Awakenings, and it's comparing people who report spontaneous spiritual or Kundalini awakenings, SSA and SKA, to endogenous and exogenous experiences. So these are kind of spiderweb charts, and it's judging, measuring the experience of unity people reported, spiritual experience, blissful state, insightfulness, disembodiment, impaired control and cognition, anxiety, complex imagery, elementary imagery, audiovisual synesthesia, and changed meaning. And on the left, the chart compares it to flotation, breathwork, Gansfield, darkroom. So these endogenous experiences, and you can see that, the spontaneous experience and a Kundalini awakening is kind of like a more abrupt spiritual awakening with a lot of physical manifestations like feeling of energy, moving, going up and down your spine. But that spontaneous experience was more profound than all of the endogenous. But even on the right here, it's comparing SSAs and SKs to DMT and psilocybin. And in almost all of those measures, again, the spontaneous experiences, endogenous experiences, not occasioned with substances, are as powerful or more powerful in almost all of those measures as even DMT, which is the active psychedelic in ayahuasca and psilocybin or mushrooms. Next, psychology and automatic writing. So automatic writing is this modality of just letting your pen or typing, just kind of letting it flow and not trying to control it. This is used in therapy to access the subconscious. And keep in mind that under idealism, there's this spectrum, the personal subconscious or unconscious. It's a spectrum from the personal or individual to a universal unconscious because it's all connected. And there's numerous accounts of individuals believing that their writing is sourced externally. It's coming from a source outside of themselves. There's a study on Brazilian spirit writers claiming to communicate with spirits and writing down the messages. There's an fMRI, so a functional magnetic resonance imaging, viewing their brain activity, showing that there's decreased activity in their writing and their motor centers during these trance states, which you would expect the opposite, despite the fact that they're producing complex content. So the area of the brain that you would use to write and control a pen is actually decreasing, yet they're doing those things. A Course in Miracles is a channeled book. It's 1,333 pages, channeled by Helen Schuckman, who was a psychologist and atheist who claimed to receive communication from some voice, some entity that identified himself as Jesus. It's an extremely popular text, regarded by many as a significantly spiritual text, and in many ways more consistent with esotericism and non-duality than the Book of Mormon. So this just demonstrates how profound texts, very complex ones, can emerge from perceived external sources. So I think there's a big problem with these simplistic false dichotomies that, the Book of Mormon is either prophetic scripture or fraudulent text. And both sides, the apologists and the anti-Mormon or ex-Mormon fall into this false dichotomy. It fails to capture the significance of the text as a reflection of Joseph's psyche and a possible access to a universal unconscious. It also fails to represent the very real possibility that Joseph truly believed he was channeling a history, even if he didn't have plates. He could have seen or experienced these plates that he thought exist or felt or was convinced that they exist, but as time went on, realized he wasn't going to have physical access to them in this dimension, but still was able to access something that he was sure it wasn't coming from him, and then used some plates as kind of a prop for a buy-in for other people. And supporting this false dichotomy really plays into, I think, Jeffrey R. Holland and Hugh Nibley's challenges about the Book of Mormon, that it's from heaven or from hell. It's that's impossible that this could be made up. I think there's plenty of examples of things that don't support that dichotomy. So I think even if you're dismissing the Book of Mormon simply as automatic writing, which is I believe a step ahead of or above, dismissing it as just an outright fraud. If you do this without really trying to understand this phenomena and how difficult it is to explain without a metaphysical framework like a universal unconscious, I think again is a failure of due diligence. So if we view the Book of Mormon as a piece of automatic writing and therefore it's going to be a peek into Joseph Smith's psyche, and the themes, the elements within the book will reflect Joseph Smith's inner psyche, just like it would in therapy. So we can look at some of these, the most prominent themes in the Book of Mormon and see these parallels to how these things played out in Joseph Smith's life. We look at the things that are most judged or most sensational in the Book of Mormon, and it's very fascinating to see the parallels in Joseph Smith's life. So, for example, in Jacob 2, there's a really strong condemnation of polygamy, which is somewhat odd given, how polygamy played out in the early church and ended up, being a large contributing factor in his downfall. And so, I think this reflects the inner conflict and moral struggle within Joseph Smith. There's also this really strong condemnation of Gadianton robbers and secret works. Yet in Joseph Smith's life in the early church history, there's this parallel with the formation of the Danites and the things that the Danites were said to have done, which in Method Infinite, it's very fascinating to read about the Danites. So again, there's this struggle with secrecy and violence. In First Nephi, we have the killing of Laban. Nephi kills Laban and justifies it as that it's better that one man should perish than a whole nation dwindle in unbelief. So there's this kind of utilitarian ends justifying the means, something that would traditionally be considered wrong or against the commandments, deception, justifiable because it's leading to or contributing to bringing salvation to people, I think would line up with, a situation that I think would be very likely that Joseph Smith really believed that there was this ancient history of the Native Americans, and likely even thought that he was going to find or access some record, and then maybe later shifted to viewing that as an artifact that wouldn't be in this reality, but still felt like he was accessing some actual history that it was channeling, and probably used prop plates to get buy-in from others. So I think that's a real possibility and would line up with this idea that there's deception, and that's okay because the greater good that you are seeking to bring about. And then there's this interesting number of antichrists with nihilistic or self-serving behavior. You just need to take care of yourself because there's no guarantee that there's a savior or whatnot. Very, very much condemned in the Book of Mormon. And yet Joseph Smith introduced this doctrine of, calling an election made sure, which is essentially this assurance of salvation, no matter what you do, as long as you don't commit the unpardonable sin. So I think this is a reflection of these kind of internal existential doubts that Joseph Smith had and wrestling with this, divine assurance or universal salvation. There's also the wicked priests abducting and marrying daughters in the Book of Mormon that eventually enveloped Stockholm Syndrome and pleaded for their captors, very much paralleling some of these marriages to young teenagers, speaking to these power dynamics, lack of consent or consent issues. There's a really strong condemnation of wealth throughout the Book of Mormon. I mean, the whole pride cycle ebbs and flows directly in correlation with money and this inequality and the condemnation of seeking money for spiritual, this idea of priestcraft, that you'd be paid for spiritual labor. Yet there's several financial ventures and controversies in Joseph Smith's life He was understandably seeking for financial stability and to be supported by the church. And so I think this just speaks to this kind of internal struggle with the materialism and his childhood trauma of, growing up in pretty severe poverty and numerous financial crises of his family. And then there's this duality between the Nephites and the Lamanites, and think about, how kind of unidimensional the characters in the Book of Mormon are. It's very dualistic. They're good or they're evil, and not much depth to these characters. And, kind of just switching back and forth, very black and white duality. And I think this speaks to a duality within Joseph Smith and probably this inner conflict. I think he was really tapped into spiritual, experiences, mystical experiences, but also had, deep, significant, unintegrated shadows. And so it's very common for people to have this mixture of self-judgment, self-hatred that they try to counteract with, self-aggrandizing behavior. And so I think the Book of Mormon really is a powerful peek into Joseph Smith's psyche if we view it as automatic writing, but go further and consider the implications, both kind of metaphysically, but also psychologically, of the Book of Mormon as a book of automatic writing. So I think the big picture perspective is that Joseph Smith experienced expanded states of awareness, mystical states, whether endogenous or exogenous. I don't know. I don't think it matters as much. There are Platonic ideas and mystical experiences that, appear to have been filtered through his brain, his traumas, his beliefs, his culture. I think it's clear that Joseph Smith believed, but to what extent, I'm not sure. Belief and doubt really are not mutually exclusive. And I think it's very simplistic to think that it is. The Book of Mormon, I think, is very ununique, but I think it's a reflection of his inner world. There's a lot of other comparable, or I would say more impressive texts with regards to their correlation with esoteric philosophy than the Book of Mormon. There is some esoteric stuff in the Book of Mormon, but I think the Book of Mormon is this treasure trove of peering into it and trying to understand what was going inside Joseph Smith, what he thought about himself. I don't think there were any gold plates, but I think it's very likely, if we consider these altered states of consciousness, that he could have, seen them, but then eventually failed to get them in physical reality and kind of adjusted his beliefs that this is an actual record that I can access, because it's not coming from me. And even then, can waver back and forth on like, is this me, or is this coming from somewhere else? But I think it's very likely that there were prop plates that help others buy in that may not have understood this. I think we need to be more validating of the experiences of those in church history and in church today. This doesn't mean we need to agree with the interpretations of exactly what happened or what it meant, but we get in the habit of calling these hallucinations or elevation, emotions, imagination. And if we do this without really understanding consciousness, neuroscience, or psychology, again, I think this is a failure of due diligence, and we're just using some hand waving to handle things that we don't really know how to explain. I think the original Mormonism was an impressive integration of esotericism. If you read The Immortality Key, I think it makes a really good case for religion stemming from psychedelic and mystical roots. And I think that Mormonism is a good case study of this happening in very recent times. But I think Mormonism has strayed very far from those esoteric roots, which I think all religions do. But because of that, those esoteric roots are increasingly resurfacing across the spectrum of healthiness too, maybe Denver Snuffer on the one hand, but visions of glory and Lori Vallow and Tim Ballard on the other hand. I think there are some Mormonism, hits that it got with these esoteric and Platonic truths, but that there were a lot of misses as well due to just this lack of integration. And then it's kind of some more breadcrumbs here to show some of these connections. There's evidence that Joseph Smith taught reincarnation to several people, including plural wives in the late Nauvoo era. There's Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts that were discovered in the 1940s that have some interesting parallels to Mormon teachings. So the Apocalypse of James is a text where Christ is essentially teaching passwords to James to give the archons, or kind of these angel demons, after death to escape the matrix and to get into the highest level of heaven. Then there's the Apocalypse of Adam, which is the myth of Adam and Eve. And in it, Adam is taught by 3 messengers, as well as it includes a Christ-like figure that's rumored to be born, to be the child born after a king impregnates his daughter. So kind of overlaps with, the messengers in the temple endowment, as well as, Brigham Young's idea that Christ's birth is a literal union between God and Mary. There's, a lot of interesting similarities between the priesthood and Reiki, which is an energy healing modality that originated in Japan. Interestingly enough, there's several studies supporting Reiki's efficacy, including a systematic review. Then this one's really interesting. So there's Kolob, the concept of Kolob, so the star closest to where God lives, or where God lives from the book of Abraham, is very similar to this New Age mythology view of Sirius, the star system, and star seeds. So star seeds are essentially a concept similar to the noble and great ones in Abraham 3. So these are consciousnesses from star systems like Sirius choosing to incarnate on Earth to help navigate this difficult period of polarization. So these are kind of advanced consciousnesses helping Earth navigate, having special roles on Earth. KLB is the Hebrew word for dog, and keep in mind that Hebrew doesn't use vowels. Sirius is the dog star, and it's also one of the most important stars to Egypt. So, which is where the book of Abraham is claimed to originate. So there's kind of bizarre overlap of, potentially kind of a proto New Age idea of Sirius and these star seeds. Early church leaders had very animistic views, teaching that the earth is a living organism. The concept of Zion being of one heart and one mind is essentially identical to the concept of a collective consciousness. There's a fascinating quote in the Lectures on Faith, which used to be part of the scriptures. Quote, "Christ possesses the same mind with the Father, which mind is the Holy Spirit," which I think is very clear, this idealistic, idealism of one mind that, Christ and the Father share, but I would argue that all of us manifest from, and all of reality manifests from. Patriarchal blessings. These are very similar to the New Age concept of Akashic records and channeling. The Akasha is thought of as this kind of extra dimensional place with all information that people can access and kind of read information for you. And it's similar to a patriarchal blessing. It doesn't take away your free will. It's not a guarantee of what will or won't happen. And if things don't happen as planned, then it's either attributed to, maybe the person that was channeling wasn't quite in tune, or you weren't faithful or took a different path. So very, very similar there. Burning in the bosom, this concept in Doctrine and Covenants is very similar to sensations described in transcendent experiences and Kundalini awakenings. The Kundalini energy is described as kind of these electric feelings or sensations or burning that goes up and down your spine, or that you can feel throughout your body. And so in conclusion, I think philosophy, quantum physics, psychology, exploring spiritual traditions, this all leads to this idealism and this oneness. I think there's evidence in all those that the most coherent framework is one of idealism. So with idealism, that all is one, that means that the concept of love God and love your neighbor as yourself really just collapses to love, because God, neighbor, self, those distinctions fall away. Treating others as yourself isn't just a helpful hack. The golden rule is just something that it'd be nice if we all did. It's literally the truth. It's the fundamental nature of everyone is the same. We all emanate from the same mind. Each of our highest self is the same. In Mark 3:24, it says, if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. This is often interpreted differently, but this does sound like, well, maybe it's not an admonition that you need to be aligned or can't divide, but just really talking about the true nature of reality. Similarly, in Matthew 6:24, no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Again, I think this may point to, it's not that you can't serve two masters, but perhaps there aren't two masters. So under idealism, God and Satan, they're essentially just projected out parts of ourselves. And interestingly enough, I think a better conceptualization is that like angel and devil in the cartoons on our soldiers that look like ourselves. So also this good and evil, I think that's difficult for people to let go of this idea of evil, because of course it exists. You can see in the world these things happening, but I think under idealism, it's more helpful to view, we are all filters of reality, of the one. And it's as though, the universe is a puzzle, and each of us are given a copy of that puzzle that we put together ourselves. And you can have your puzzles in different stages. You can mash pieces together. You can go down, a path because you've got some pieces connected that eventually it just does not work. And, puzzles that look more put together and uniform look much better than those that are not put together or put together incorrectly. But the idea that God and Satan are separate entities or forces apart from the universe, I think is akin to, believing that like, my puzzle isn't put together correctly. I need some more of the good puzzle pieces here. Or, because things aren't fitting together, it's because there's the evil puzzle pieces here, that I need to get rid of. And the solution is to get rid of those pieces, when it's really good would be, or God, refer to more a harmonization of the parts, whereas evil represents not puzzle pieces or things in and of themselves in the kit, but it's a disordering or disharmony of those pieces. And I think this is a much more coherent and helpful view, where we're not banishing Satan or casting people to hell, but we're rather ordering and finding harmony there. I think that when we really look at other people, it's very easy to judge people, especially people that do horrendous things. When we objectively, logically look at these mysteries of like why you are you, why your consciousness of all the consciousnesses, why it's why you're observing, you're experiencing the one that you're experiencing, if you really question that and explore that, you really have zero reason to believe that you would do anything different than anyone else. Say you were born with the same genetics, the same environmental factors, the same family, the same traumas, same experiences in your early life as somebody who committed, very heinous acts. Like, what reason do you have? What logical reason do you have that you would have done anything differently? I don't think anybody can have a coherent reason without a lot of hand waving of, faithfulness in the pre-existence, or I would just do differently. I mean, I think it's really people that are oblivious to that. They're really not being rigorous at their understanding of neuroscience and psychology and how we develop and our filters and how traumas affect us. So this isn't to say that we just accept everything that everybody does, but have compassion, find a way to balance grieving and working towards a more harmonious world, while also being compassionate of everybody affected by these atrocities and what we call evil and suffering in this world. And working towards, putting our effort towards love and connection and healing, and how do we prevent and heal from the evil that we see in the world, so that the next generations don't experience that, rather than just recycling those traumas and having zero awareness of the type of magical thinking that makes you believe like, oh yeah, if I were in their shoes, I would do something different. This gets at these deep questions of free will and determinism. For me, Mormonism has brought some of my deepest and most painful wounds, and is connected to some of the most difficult and painful aspects of my life. But I'm also, incredibly grateful, because it's really the perfect setup to feel like you have all the answers and to be so confident, and then have that all collapse and lose faith and question everything. And then have, once you question everything and deconstruct not only religion, but language and reality and science and spirituality, you've got this beautiful case study of some of these really mystical ideas of channeling and universal unconscious and altered states of consciousness, mystical experiences. And so I think it's actually one of the most beautiful and promising, and it's a path that I think many have been able to go through and integrate. And if you can get to the other side, integrate both science and spirituality, and keep some of the most beautiful aspects of Mormon doctrines, I think, but in a more internally consistent and coherent way. So I went through what would be considered a Kundalini awakening, which is it's like a Hindu term for very chaotic and abrupt, spontaneous spiritual awakening, with some, physical manifestations of, feeling this energy and, non-ordinary states of consciousness, endogenously, unintended. And so for me, that involved these synchronicities that I experienced that, really, you'd call them spiritual experiences in a religion. And really in Mormonism, I didn't experience like really any of these, certainly not to this degree, but these synchronicities, really broke my materialist perspective and were deeply ungrounding at times. But I think that's often what it involves in deconstructing some of the most fundamental ideas and beliefs that we have about causality and linear time and materialism and the nature of reality. And so in some of these experiences, I felt it was kind of broken open through the things I was going through, divorce and a job transition and financial insecurities. Just put me in this space to really feel this deep love and connection, oneness with others and with the universe, that something I'd never felt before, and made me realize like, oh, I had always thought that these concepts of nirvana and bliss were kind of fanciful, which is sort of silly to think that, so much of the world population has been pursuing some things without merit. There is something there, but it's very difficult to wrap your head around. So it's ineffable. And so really an experience or a gnosis is an important part of this journey. So in conclusion, going back to the dream analogy, this means that everyone is a mirror of ourself. And this is our true self, not just the dream avatar. The other person in the dream isn't you, the dream avatar, that ego. It's something greater, something more expansive. And so in a dream, there's no hell in a dream. There's no place that we're separated, that you can be separated from, where you can just cast the bad guys and handle the problem. It's just sweeping things under the rug there that you will have to deal with later. And similarly, there's no heaven in a dream unless we make it together. So thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to reach out to me at mysticsandmuons@gmail.com. And I hope you have a great day.